Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar of the AHRD Leadership SIG for 2019. My name is Dr. Oliver Crocco. Most people call me Ozzy, and I'm the chair of the Leadership SIG. And I thought before we get started, I would just give you one quick introduction about the Academy of Human Resource Development and the Leadership SIG in particular. So for those of you who don't know, AHRD was formed to encourage systematic study of HRD theories, processes, and practices, to disseminate information about HRD, to encourage the application of HRD research findings, and to provide opportunities for social interaction among individuals with scholarly and professional interests in HRD from multiple disciplines and from across the globe. The Academy's vision is leading the profession through research. And just that last line about multiple disciplines from across the globe, I think we are perfectly embodying that today. The SIG, Leadership SIG, SIG, for those of you who don't know, stands for Special Interest Group, is a mechanism to foster scholarship, dissemination of information, and fellowship among persons of similar academic and or professional interests. And we, the Leadership SIG, are specifically designed to enhance the knowledge of our members and also to reach out to others to share expertise and research on the area of leadership development and other sort of related areas, which brings us to our guests and presenters today. I would like to introduce Dr. Travor Brown, who is a professor of labor relations and human resources with Memorial University. Since joining Memorial University, he has also served as the Associate Dean for Research and the Director of the Master of Employment Relations program. Much of his research examines issues concerning goal setting and training effectiveness, with a special focus on performance management and leadership development. He is currently Associate Editor with Human Resource Development Quarterly. With that introduction, I would also like to say that for those of you who are not members of the Academy of Human Resource Development, or who are and would like to join the Leadership SIG, we will reach out to you, please, via email after the webinar. I will also make the announcement that this webinar will be made available to the Leadership SIG members and those who registered via email after the conclusion of the webinar. All right, I think I've talked for long enough to allow any people who are lingering in the room late to have joined us by now. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Travor Brown.
Perfect. Thank you, Oliver. So as Oliver said, my name is Travor Brown, and in fact, this is truly a global research team working on this today. So I will present much of the content, but I'm delighted to have two of the three co-authors with me today. Martin McCracken, who is at the University of Ulster as the research director at the business school there, and Paula O'Kane, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Otago, New Zealand. Very much like most of our work, time zone becomes an interesting thing. So to give you a sense, it's about 8 in the morning for Paula, 9 in the evening for Martin, and where I'm located in the far east of Canada, it's 5:30. I thought it would help to give a little bit of background. I'm going to go ahead and just share the slides at this point and sort of stop the video. So, sorry, let's go back to, sorry. Gotta love when this happens the way you want it to. All right. For some reason, I can't minimize Zoom when I'm recording. Anyone know a quick way around that? Oh.
Try escape, Trevor.
Try escape, Trevor. This is where you get to see just how technical I am, right? Share, Zoom, whiteboard. Pardon me?
It seems to me I can share this. I've got the PowerPoint slides up.
I can do it.
I've made a couple of changes, of course, just lucky me. Bill, if I stop recording for a second to put something on, is that going to really throw things off?
No, you should be fine. Just hit the record after you go in.
All right, so I will stop recording for a second, and I will.
Okay, and you have the share button at the bottom, right?
Yeah, I do have that, but for some reason it's not actually pulling up the slides I want to pull up. They were there. Oh wait, now let's try this.
Okay. There you go.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
Well done, Trevor.
Well, you know, those that can, just let me make sure I'm still.
Yeah, we're recording good.
So recording, perfect. Anyways, my apologies. You can clearly see how technical I am today. The author that can't join us today is Bishakha Mazumdar, who is a recent PhD graduate from here at the University of Cape Breton. In terms of background, how this all got started was probably around 2014 or so, and I guess the connection between the three of the four authors is I've spent a sabbatical at the University of Ulster. Paula has been employed at the University of Ulster, as is Martin, so that's where the connection for the three of us comes in. Around 2014, 2013, we were looking at the experience of practitioners around performance management systems, challenges, successes, things like that. And as we started going through, one of the things that really hit us is one of the disconnect, as I'll call it, between what we were hearing from practitioners and what we recalled seeing in the literature. And at that point, I think it was Paula who appropriately challenged us to say, are we really certain there's a disconnect? Let's go back and have a look at the literature and see what is actually going on. And that was kind of the premise that started this research in terms of an in-depth literature review of performance management to get a sense of what the trends, future directions are, and things like that. In terms of getting started, there's no question, some of you may think we're nuts looking at this area. Performance management clearly does have multiple image problems. Even the effective practice guidelines from SHRM note things like performance management being the Achilles heel of HRM. Despite the amount of time and effort and resources devoted to it, it rarely achieves its purpose in terms of improving performance. Some have called it, and this is probably my favorite quote, a workplace evil that must be destroyed like a blood-sucking vampire, a dreaded management ritual, and Pfeffer's quote of managers don't like giving appraisals and employees don't like receiving them. And if that wasn't bad enough, there's problems in practice. It's often seen as this mechanical yearly ritual with very little relevance to the bottom line, failing to leverage human capital. When we were writing this paper, we came across an article by Rock and Jones looking at 30 large organizations, including GE, which has often been touted as kind of the most well-known organization around performance appraisal. With large companies moving away from ratings, annual performance goals, and forced rankings to shorter-term goals, ongoing discussions between employees and managers. And a lot of that was due to the changing nature of work. We're seeing much more team-based and global, the increased need of teamwork versus ranking against employees in competition, the need to attract, develop, and retain talent, and the need to facilitate engagement and development. And if that wasn't bad enough, there's this huge research practitioner gap in the field that's been well documented at least since the 1980s. And in particular, there was a quote by Banks and Murphy that says, practitioners suggest that organizations need to increase commitment to the appraisal system, increase communication between supervisors and subordinates regarding tasks to be performed, improve appraiser feedback and skills, and clarify objectives and criteria. Researchers, on the other hand, stress the need to sharpen observation skills, reduce rating errors, use better formats, and utilize more information. Clearly, you continue to see this gap. And one of the things that certainly piqued our attention as we went through is whether or not anything has changed in the 20 years since this quote has gone out. And then the final thing we noticed was there was this whole issue around all the terms, different terms being used. Some places said performance management, some said performance appraisal, some said performance evaluation, some say performance review. The two most common ones we saw were performance management and performance appraisal, with the question being, are they really the same thing or different? So that sort of started us on our journey around this lit review, with the idea being that there was certainly no shortage of criticisms around the field, no shortage of issues in terms of the practitioner science gap. So we wanted to start a little bit before we get into the literature review with some definitions. Guinness is probably one of the better known definitions of performance management, where he defines it as a continuous process of identifying, measuring, and developing performance of individuals and teams, and highlights the idea of aligning performance with strategic goals of the organization. Different perspectives in the literature on to whether performance management is or isn't the same as performance appraisal. So there's one school that basically says, and I apologize for anyone, we've shorthanded it to PA for performance appraisal and PM for performance management. There's one school of thought that basically says performance appraisal is just one element of the broader PM system. It's basically your annual review exercise that involves, identification of objectives, ratings, raters, whereas the performance management cycle is ongoing, if not continuous. So that approach clearly says that PA is different than PM because PA is just part of the PM process. Then you've got others, particularly Latham and Wexley, who basically say, well, no, really PA does include all the elements of performance management. If you look at their work, and some of the Latham and Wexley work goes back to 1977, it does talk about the alignment of individual and teams to organizational goals. So the last slide I want to get into before we get into the actual method and the lit review is a little bit of background information. Historically, whether we call this performance appraisal or performance management, there's been discussion of the dual purpose. One idea is motivation and development, and certainly that's where a lot of the HRD literature is focused. And the second is more administrative, pay, performance, promotions, things of that nature. And when we looked at the broader literature, there were a number of frameworks that largely included three elements. Some idea of defining performance, and that nicely lines up with Guinness's idea of identify performance expectations. An element of evaluating and reviewing performance, which is akin to Guinness's measure. And finally, providing consequences for performance, which is developed. And as you'll see as we go through this, when we did the study, we ended up putting an extra element into that framework going forward. So really, when Martin, Paula, Bishakha, and I started this, we really had three goals. One was we wanted to conduct a review of current performance management research. Second, we wanted to get a sense of what research gaps were present. And in particular, because we just come off that qualitative study of practitioners, getting a sense of, was there a big disconnect between practitioners and academics? And really looking at the prevalence of research in terms of what terms are really being used. Is it management or appraisal? I'll weave a little bit into this, and Martin and Paula, feel free to jump in at any point. We started calling this a systematic literature review. And one of the great things about the review process is the refinements. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the extra analysis we did during the revision of this paper for final publication. But changing it to a scoping review, because we really weren't looking at all of the content and everything throughout the papers, but really we were focusing mostly on the abstract and what was being highlighted in the articles. We picked the period of 2005 to 2016. I'll tell you a little bit about why we picked 2005 for the starting point. Ryans et al. Had an 2004 publication in the Annual Review of Psychology that basically reviewed the performance appraisal literature up to that point. And the other reason we picked that as a starting point is that the SHRM guidelines for effective practice on performance management came out in 2004. So we felt that the 2005 point made a sense to starting off. Wanted to make sure we had at least a decade of research. And then in the next slide or two, you'll kind of see that we bumped the tail end a little bit in terms of how we got to the time frame of 2016. So walking through our scoping literature review, and I have to thank Paula, because Paula did a lot of this work early on in terms of putting all these things together. One of the things around a scoping literature review is you need to have clear criteria of what's going to be included in your lit review. So in terms of our search boundaries, when we started this in 2016, it was a Financial Times 45. It's changed to 50, but because we started this in 2016, we kept it at the FT 45. If you're not familiar with the UK system, there's the ABS list that's used for research funding and rankings in the United Kingdom. We looked at the categories where we felt we were most likely to see HR and HRD related research concerning performance management. So HR and employee studies, general management, psychology, org studies. We did look at electronic databases, in particular Business Source Complete, Academic Search Premier. And as I'll talk a little bit later, we were asked as we went through this paper to do a specific HRD search of journals, including a hand search. And we specify that here because it did include 2 journals that didn't hit the FT 45 or ABS list. In terms of the search terms we used going through when we started this, given the diversity of terms used, you'll see the phrases performance appraisal, performance review, performance evaluation, performance management. And we did not search through the entire full text. We were looking for those words either in the title, the abstract, or what's known as the subject term for classification. You'll see the period there was 2005 to 2016. Basically, we originally did it until the end of 2015. As it took a little while to gather the data, by the time we had gotten that, we were already well into 2016, so then we updated the time frame to 2016. The other thing to bear in mind is that we did specifically do a search, a manual hand search of HRD journals in March of 2018. In terms of who was involved in this, Bishakha Mazumdar, who is an author on this paper, was a PhD student at the time, who worked with the subject librarian to do the initial searches. You can see the search fields that were used. And clear thing I want to point out is that performance management or performance appraisal needed to be a main subject of the paper. And that was judged by 2 of the authors, depending which part of the process we're going through. You will see that we excluded some articles a little later. Largely, that's because it focused on another part of performance management. So I learned, which was new to me, that in operations management research, you do see some work on performance management, et cetera. That's not in the same vein as what we're doing. So any papers that popped up around that were excluded. In terms of the coding, we're very fortunate that Paula is a guru at in vivo. So you'll see there's some in vivo coding going through. We basically did a deductive first, looking at a synthesis of the effective performance management models out there. And that's really the 3 criteria we spoke about earlier in terms of identification, measuring, and development. And then we looked at inductive, where basically we looked at the themes within those broad categories. So this was actually coded twice. Round 1, Bishakha and I independently coded each article, placed it in an Excel spreadsheet, and then we met to discuss the results and did some recoding. Round 2, and I guess also showing the global nature of our team, one of the great things, in my opinion, that happened, although it was a lot of work at the time, but I think it really improved the paper, and it's one of the benefits of peer review, is the first edition we put of the literature review. We got some appropriate pushback, in my opinion, around, well, where did these gaps come from? You know, where is the evidence to show that these gaps are actually gaps in the literature? So it resulted in Paula and I actually recoding most of the data, going through all the papers again to really come up with extra data that we'll talk about in terms of country of origin, you know, the sample and things like that. Being a global team, Paula and I were fortunate she was on sabbatical, so we actually spent a few days here in Newfoundland together doing it. And then we spent a 12-hour time zone difference between the 2 of us, coding through Skype and FaceTime, which was an interesting experience to do, but we actually went through and coded everything. And again, in terms of validation of the coding, you'll see there's 2 ways we did it. One was a manual, so comparison of coding between coder A and B, wherever that happened to be in round 1 or 2, discussion of coding discrepancies, and then agree. The other thing we did was also do a text search for search terms and word frequencies of all the abstracts within in vivo. And certainly I'll throw any questions on this over to Paula should they come up later, but basically what we did is all of the abstracts that would have included the titles were downloaded and then put into in vivo, which enabled Paula to be able to do a text-based search for going through. All right, a little bit about the sample before we get into the results. You will recall I said as this paper was shepherded through, we did a second analysis or second sample. So we started off with 219 papers from 39 journals. 5 were removed because PM or performance management was not a central focus. That could be because it was more of an operations focus, or there was one word mentioned and we're not quite sure how it ended up getting hit along the way, but basically they were removed because it wasn't a central focus. During the journal review process, we added an HRD journal focus. So we manually searched HRD journals. We added 16 papers. So the final sample was 230 peer-reviewed papers from 41 journals. The other thing that's actually not on the grid that it should be clear is that we also restricted our sample to English journals only. So we didn't include any journals that weren't produced in English. High levels, as I mentioned earlier, when we talk about our themes, we largely looked initially at 3 groups that come from Kaniki, Haynes, sorry, there's a typo on my slide there, it should be Anne Saint-Ange. The idea of defining performance, evaluating, reviewing performance, akin to, again, it says measure, and providing consequences. We actually add in our discussion a 4th area we call context, which gets into climate, culture, and things like that. When I get to our results, you will see that we actually had a large number of papers that hit some sort of area of context, and that's why we added that to our structure. So this is at a very high level, and the paper does break it down much further, but I do want to highlight a couple of things here. Landy and Farr, way back in 1980, called for a cease of all performance appraisal format research. The idea of looking at format issues of trait versus outcome versus behavior and the time to end it. And we were somewhat shocked to see that about 25% of the articles we found still looked at some element of format. You name it, from graphic rating scales to behavior scales to force distribution, but there was still a lot of focus on performance appraisal format. Similarly, about 20%, and I've got some of these in bold here, under evaluate and review performance, you will see looking at psychometric properties. You think of Thorndike's, reliability, validity, freedom from bias, practicality. A lot of focus in particular in our sample on freedom from bias. That was by far, of those 47, hits 40 around freedom from bias. Not surprisingly, we also saw a lot of discussion around consequences for performance. Linkages to HR systems, in particular pay and performance, was the largest of the hits there. And the other area, which I was actually pleased to see, was employee reaction. Around 1998, Colley did a meta-analysis of papers on employee reaction, calling for more research on employee reaction. And certainly when we did our thematic analysis, we found about 44% of papers were looking at something about employee reaction. Where the early ones would have been largely around satisfaction, actually the largest hit was justice. Anything around justice and fairness was largely the areas we saw the most, but included things like satisfaction, justice, commitment, fairness, a number of things going through. At this point, I'll just kind of highlight, if you look at many of the things there, they do tend to lead a bit more towards the more traditional performance appraisal side of things. So if you look at under the defining performance high-level theme, you'll see that alignment of goals to strategic direction was discussed in only about 10% of the papers. You see a lot of focus on format, psychometric properties, consequences. Again, and those will often be seen as traditional performance appraisal issues. The other thing, and you'll see the hit there for 88 under culture. While the models we presented earlier didn't discuss a lot about culture, we certainly were finding a lot of different themes around culture. It could include national culture, and that would be things like expatriate, multinational, some things that specified culture within an organization. And the other area we called environmental factors that included things like about 19 papers specifically in the public sector. My background's labor relations and HR. We found about 11 papers looking at the union element. Disappointingly, very little around newer forms of work in terms of virtual work or virtual context, with only about 3 of those. I mentioned earlier that given Paula's techniques and background in vivo, we could actually go through and do an in vivo keyword presentation. And again, I've highlighted a couple of things because if you look at all the hits there, and I should be clear, you'll notice that the counts are much higher than the number of articles. We had 230 articles, but a word may have been repeated more than once in an abstract. So that's why it's no surprise that given the area we were looking at, there was 860 plus hits using some deviation of performing. And you'll see the stemmed words there. So it could have been performance, perform, performee, performers, etc. Really want to highlight, though, there were over 500 hits for words like evaluators, appraisers, or rater. So a lot of discussion around those or stemmed words. A lot of hits around ratings with 203. A lot of hits around systems, 183. And again, as we looked at this from a perspective of the literature, we still saw a pretty heavy focus on what some would call the more traditional performance appraisal. Rating employees, ratings, and things of that nature. I want to talk a little bit about some of the things we found when we started getting into the extra analysis that HRDR had us do, and actually it helped quite a bit in our opinion. If you look at, where the country of the research setting was, one of the things that really stood out to us was just how focused it was on the developed world. So you had about 77 studies coming from some part of Europe. You had over 50 coming from Asia and North America. And by the way, for those of you with a quantitative background, I've got an asterisk here. That doesn't mean any of these are statistically significant. They were just things that jumped out to us when we looked through. And you notice 2 for South America and 4 for Africa. So very much a literature that is focused on largely what we would call, the well-established developed countries. Research methodology, some great things that we were pleased to see. And I should be clear when I go through some of these counts, some of these studies use more than one method, and that's the reason why if you were to add all this up, this will be more than 230. But if we had over 60% of our sample of the journals we looked at using some sort of real field data versus laboratory, and we thought that was really good to see. Unfortunately, there was only 14 papers, or about 6% of our sample, that actually used real performance data. Quite often what we were noticing when we went through the literature, it was a manager or someone else's perception of performance on a 5-point scale, as opposed to real performance data being there. I love meta-analysis. If you think of evidence-based practice, one of the best things to ground your practice in is good meta-analytic data or studies of studies. So good to see some of those there, but we were disappointed to see that only 6 of these studies were longitudinal. And again, if you think of the real world of performance management, when I used to manage some of those systems, really a one-stop snapshot in time doesn't really capture what's going on. In terms of participants, and again, I'm just going to highlight that in some cases we had studies that used more than one type of participant. Pleased to see that really a broad spectrum of different participants involved. About 44% were employees, you had 30% of managers. The student one, we had to make a decision on. In some papers, the students were people who were in an MBA program or an executive education program, etc., who were also working while being a student. We made the decision, rightly or wrongly, that we noted in the paper, that if they were approached because of their involvement in a learning environment, we classified them as a student. But there are some of those studies where it says 26 students that could have involved someone in an executive MBA or an executive development program who was actually a working manager at the same time. And there were a handful, not even quite a handful, that looked at union reps. One of the things we'll highlight when we get to the gaps, though, was not a lot of HR practitioners were specifically included as participants. Much more leaning to manager and employee going through. All right, probably not a shock, and I didn't ask the question earlier, but no question performance appraisal was still the most cited word we were seeing. It was mentioned in terms of an in vivo text search in about 50%, 47%, versus performance management. Their ballpark around 30%. And you notice the other two really don't get covered at all. But clearly there is a dominance in the literature looking at performance appraisal. And we were asked this by a reviewer, whether or not that changed over time. And when we looked at it, we could not see any real theme that over time you were seeing performance appraisal used less than performance management. All right, I'll get to the research gaps, limitations, then I'll open up for questions and things like that. The paper, which, by the way, is available on ResearchGate. We have the pre-published version accessible through ResearchGate. We can't put the final version up there because of copyright restrictions of the journal, but the pre-publication one is up there, and it has all the information, so you're free to have a look at it. In terms of some of the gaps we noticed, I didn't touch a whole lot on goal setting going through, but one of the things is people often think of goals in terms of your annual goals and performance management cycle. Not a lot of discussion about the other types of goals, whether that's short and long-term goals. Maybe think of the reference to the 30 large companies that have now gone to shorter-term goals. Not a lot of discussion of a new area in goal-setting theory called subconscious goals, where goals aren't explicit, but not a lot of discussion of team goals. So certainly we feel there's a need for increased research on the different types of goals in the context of performance management. In terms of the second one, I'm going to use my wording on it. Paula and Marty may disagree with me. I was really disappointed at how little there was around goal alignment, the idea of aligning individual goals and team goals to the overall direction of the organization. Again, you'll recall about 10% of the articles covered that. So clearly there's a need for HR practitioners and others to really be involved in integrating individual and team goals with organizational goals. That's the whole reason we talk about strategic performance management. There's very little coverage of that in literature. I certainly am supportive of Landy and Farr's call in 1980 that further research and performance management format is probably not going to be overly valuable. We've got a slight caveat, though. There's an interesting movement towards what some are calling narrative forms of performance management or performance appraisal. If you're not familiar with a narrative form, basically there's no ratings, there's no rankings. It's basically qualitative summary feedback of performance. We think that's very much in line with the idea of informal conversations, and that's something we saw when we spoke to our practitioners. And we also think it's in line with what we were seeing from those 30 large organizations moving away from formal rankings. A lot of these research gaps, because of the journal we were publishing in, are focused very much towards the HRD or human resource development side of things. Certainly designing, implementing, and evaluating feedback training. Feedback did not get a lot of hits in terms of our themes. It was only about 10 articles that really looked at feedback. And that's certainly something we think needs more work, particularly given the movement to more informal systems and the movement to more comprehensive performance management. And really there's two things we'd highlight there. One is the design, implementation, and evaluation of feedback training, and also the idea that training feedback providers on how to have effective performance management conversations. And it's interesting that Banks and Murphy quote from 1985 highlighted that as a gap in between scholars and practitioners, and that's something we're still seeing in literature to get today. Lots of our research that looked at, when we did the theme analysis, sort of the consequences related to other HR systems, a lot of it looked at pay and rewards. One of the things we think there's lots of opportunity for future research now is how to mitigate the negative aspects of that performance management rewards linkage. And again, I'll go back to that study of 30 firms who basically said they were moving away from forced ranking and pitting one employee against the other. And I think as a field, we need to start figuring out that, how do we mitigate the downside of pay for performance? Building on the idea of systems, very little of the literature we saw was looking at administrative purposes beyond pay. Just to give you a sense, when we were going through, there was all of 6 that looked at the linkage between performance management and downsizing. There were less than 15 that looked at career development or learning and development. We're talking about performance management as an overall system and it being continuous. We'd expect to see tighter linkages to all parts of the broader HR system. I know there's some debate about what is HRD versus HRM, so I'm going to say HRM at this point, because generally when you think of layoff, staffing, and things like that, people tend to think a bit more about the HRM side of the house. Again, going back to the strategic alignment of performance management, the linkage between performance management practices and bottom line organizational measures, profitability, productivity, sustainability, ethical behavior, very little coverage in the literature around those things. And again, we think that's an area that certainly needs more coverage. When we think of the changing workplace, there was actually very little focus on what some will call demographic differences going through. We found about 3 that looked at age, 5 that looked at gender, 4 that looked at broader diversity. They didn't define it, they just said diversity. Given the aging population that exists, particularly in much of the industrial world, we really think there's a need to start looking at the reactions of older workers towards performance management systems. Much of the literature we found to assume what I will describe a traditional workplace. Very little coverage of performance practices in virtual or collaborative workplaces. When we went through, there were all of 3 that made any reference to virtual office or team. And that's certainly not reflective of current organizations, where many people are working from multiple sites. They may be coming in, at least what I know in Canada is hoteling. Your hot desking is the other phrase you may hear, where it may not be the same desk every day. So we think clearly we would start looking at practices in the context of a different workplace. Building on the analysis by country, we are really urging for a movement to performance management research in less developed areas of the world. It was rather shocking to see that you had, basically less than 5 studies in South America and Africa. Not to offend anyone that may have an IO psych background or a psych background, much of the literature has had much of its foundation in the industrial organizational psychology side of the field, which has a heavy quantitative focus. And one of the things we're advocating going forward is for an increased use of qualitative research. When we looked through the field, while it's getting better, to give you a sense, there was 148 quantitative versus about 45 qualitative. So we think there's much more room for rich qualitative research in the area. Similarly, as I mentioned earlier, there was less than 10, and in fact only 6 studies that were longitudinal in nature. We're really advocating that if you're going to talk about performance management systems that involve real people and real systems, then we've got to stop using these very short-term studies and look at longer-term implications. Similarly, for number 14, while it's great that we're getting field data, as I mentioned earlier, we had ballpark about 60% of papers in the sample that looked at field data. It was disappointing that only about 14 or 6% actually had real performance data being used. The vast majority were perceptions of performance. Managers, customers, peers, or employees themselves using 5-point Likert scales to assess performance. And I guess bringing this full circle, really looking or advocating for an increased collaboration between practitioners and scholars. When we looked at those that participated in the field, in the studies, we found very little inclusion of the practitioners. Often practitioners involved in the design, the management, the reinvention of the fine-tuning of these systems. And I think we need to see a much tighter linkage there going forward. And I guess the last thing before I kind of open it up to questions and having Paula and Merton jump in at any point, a couple of limitations that I do want to highlight around this study. And I know Paula and I particularly found this near the end when we were doing the second analysis. We were really shocked at just how bad we are at abstracts in some cases. Often those abstracts weren't sufficiently detailed for us to be able to do any of the coding that we needed to do, which meant we had to skim read through the article. So in HRDQ about 4 years ago, Gibbons and Rousseau talked about at Peacock, population, intervention, comparison, outcome, context be included in the abstracts. And certainly where those elements were present, it was much easier for us to code many of the things, particularly around sample, country of origin, what was being done, et cetera. but we were somewhat surprised just the lack of detail in some abstracts. And the other thing that I do want to mention here, you'll recall that I mentioned we found a lot around context and culture in this study. The International Journal of HRM produces 22 issues a year. Given the scope of that journal and the international focus of that journal, many of the hits or many of the things that ended up being in that category came from that journal in this study. And we just wanted to highlight that because while many other journals, for example, many of the HRD journals only produce 4 issues a year, when you've got another journal producing 5 times that, it may have skewed the data a little bit going through. So that's it for me from a presentation perspective. I'm going to open it up to questions from anyone going through. And I guess before I do, Paula, Martin, anything you wanted to highlight in terms of my coverage of the study or anything that you wanted to add?
I think you've done a very comprehensive job there, Trevor. I think it'd be interesting to see what people think. I mean, I guess, as you say, the whole purpose of what we were doing here was to try and understand what's the kind of state of play, what's the kind of state of the art in terms of performance management, performance appraisal. And I think some of the research gaps which we got there are going to be very useful kind of talking points for quite a number of people, practitioners and academics alike, to try to understand, well, where do we go with this? Because as you quite rightly pointed out in the first slide, I mean, there's so many negative, opinions and negative viewpoints about the whole performance management field, feeling that that's not sufficient, it doesn't do a good job. So where do we go with this? And again, that as a discipline, that's what we need to think about.
I think sort of from our point of view, it was quite interesting to have the different contexts from the North American to the UK context. We've kind of found ourselves discussing things quite differently based even on our own personal experiences or the research that we've done in our individual countries. And I guess New Zealand tends to align more with the UK. And so I think the sort of emphasis on the quantitative work, which I guess also Travor is probably more quantitative as well, and Martin and I more qualitative, probably surprised me. I thought whenever I looked at systems here, we tend to have a lot more qualitatively based systems and have moved away in practice an awful lot from ratings and rankings. And I'm not sure we've ever, particularly in a New Zealand context, that many organisations would use any sort of forced ranking. So it surprised me, I guess, the difference across even the Western countries that we looked at and the approaches to performance management. So we have another study that we've begun and we haven't finished analysing yet, but what it did, and I guess just to give you an idea, is we've looked at the practitioner publications in the US, Canada, New Zealand and the UK over this sort of same 10-year period. And we have used a similar way of thematically analysing them. And so we're going to compare what the practitioner publications have compared to what the academic publications have. So hopefully we'll get that out this year. But it's, again, tends to draw up those same sorts of ideas around the differences in how performance management is done in the European sort of context and the New Zealand, Australia context versus North America. So I find that really quite interesting.
Thank you. Let's open it up to questions and comments from others.
I have a question. This is Peter Williams, just to get things started. Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm calling in from Dallas, Texas. So I teach in an EDD program. My PhD is in HRD, but I just teach one HRD course and mainly leadership. And so one of the things we try to do is, this is really a valuable session in an article. I hadn't read the article yet, but I look forward to it because we try to, teach that, if you're going to implement performance management, which you should, it needs to be evidence-based, yet what's the evidence? And so obviously it's very mixed. My specific question, so thanks for doing it first. My specific question is to do with feedback training. I'm going to assume, this is the first part of my question, that feedback training refers to training of managers and HR professionals on how to give feedback, right? Did you find any indication of feedback-seeking behaviors? Any research along those lines?
I'm looking at my coding structure here, Peter, so I'm not ignoring you. Yeah, there's nothing that we came up with the coding around feedback seeking. But I think, and Paula, you can jump in here at any point. One of the things we're sort of finding more and more is, Paula kind of coined it in our research group, kind of kept with it, the idea of conversations and the importance of the conversation. I don't know if you want to jump in at this point, Paula, because I know this is...
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, we didn't see it in the research, but I guess informally we also didn't see much along research into millennials and into the different age groups within the workplace. So that was a bit of a gap in the research around performance management as well. And so we probably see the two things as slightly aligned. The feedback-seeking behaviour we tend to associate with the millennial generation, and there's often not, there wasn't much research in there. So no, we didn't see it within the articles that we looked at. But again, maybe it would have come under different search terms, because our search terms are quite tight around performance management, and that might fall into more of day-to-day interactions around that feedback-seeking behaviour. So it might be something that didn't come through for that reason around search terms.
Peter, can I just ask you, whenever you're talking about, is this basically something which is happening whenever you're teaching your group, that they're trying to understand what's the best way of giving feedback, or are they becoming more demanding in terms of feedback of their managers and expecting more of them? Is that generally what's happening, or what's your view?
Oh, is that a question for me, Martin?
Yes, all right. Yeah.
That's a good question. I don't know that most of my students are already leaders, at least at the mid-management level, either in schools or nonprofits or government and military, et cetera. And so they have encounters with performance management systems, performance evaluation, that are by and large off-putting. I guess that would be a soft way to say negative. And so one of the things I try to convey to them is to seek feedback, to take the performance management, to be more of an agent of managing one's own performance and aligning. So based on self-determination theory and the fact that, you know, if someone evaluates my performance, usually I disagree at some level. And sometimes it can be a conversation around that. But if I instigate, then what I'm wondering is if there's any indication in the field that you found in the literature about it, kind of a shift away from who drives the process. Maybe that would be a good way to say. And that, you may have indicated that when you said there at the beginning, part of the frame is, or the assumption is, there's an administrative need, there's an organizational need for various administrative purposes. Hence, the organization and supervisors drive the process.
Yeah, I think that goes back into what we were sort of looking around, that terminology. So I guess there was the two different views on how we look at performance management and performance appraisal. And to me, performance management, I sort of see the second definition. It's a bigger picture thing about the day-to-day and the informal interactions and the conversations. And I guess the primary data collection that we did, and that was done in Canada and UK and New Zealand, and really that was this idea around practitioners of training managers and working with managers to have those day-to-day conversations with their employees come out really strongly. But we don't see that coming out as strongly in literature about the importance of those conversations. And I guess we were looking at it because we were talking to HR practitioners in our research. They were talking about managers being able to hold those conversations. They didn't talk, and Travor, Mark, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just trying to remember back to them. They didn't talk as much, or there was very little conversation about people actually looking for feedback informally. But the idea of being able to have really good, strong, and frank performance conversations and positive performance conversations came through really strongly in those practitioner interviews.
What we found in that original research was that, I mean, we were looking at the HR role in all of this. And again, obviously, HR were seen as, I would say, maybe this is a bit strong, but they're almost like a police force, if you like. This has to be done. It has to be done by this date. And managers typically didn't like that, didn't like this idea being put upon. And a lot of them would have come back and said, well, you know what, this performance appraisal thing is a tick box, it's a load of nonsense. I have some really good relationships with my employees. I work with them very well. I have conversations day in, day out, which kind of, triggered off something in us that we were thinking, okay, well, that's really what performance appraisal is, and performance management. Not the, yearly ritual. It's done, it sits on the shelf, it's never looked at again. So we tried to find out from HR people as well what they thought about this. And it was quite interesting because some HR people didn't like this going on because they said, well, they're spending time doing this. They should be, remember, we have to get this done for pay purposes, for administrative purposes, for promotion, for all those sorts of things. And we were saying, well, do you not think about how you could try and integrate these into the performance management process? And there's just a lot of, what would you say? There was maybe a bit of kind of, they're a bit stubborn at times about what they were hoping to get from performance management. Maybe they needed to think a little bit more widely about the whole process to try and get the best out of it, which made us think about the whole power of words. And I think that was a theme at one of the AOM conferences which we presented on this, to try to demonstrate how good it can be if it's done properly. But then you've got this kind of problem of HR integrating it in a useful way. But that takes a lot of work. And there's a lot of bias issues. There's a lot of potential kind of, messiness, which perhaps some people don't like. So this is where we are with performance management at the moment. But how do we kind of harness what's very good, but at the same time avoid some of the kind of potential pitfalls, which are very real, we can clearly see, I mean, Paula, you probably, that's what we found there with that,
Yeah. I mean, as you say, like the primary data collection that we did, it was the focus we sort of moved towards was the power of words, and the conversations are so important, but not coming through often.
And I'll just kind of close the loop. To me, and to certainly when the team has discussed this, it really highlights the difference between traditional performance appraisal and performance management. If performance management is about continuous and ongoing, then that's where the importance of these ongoing discussions and conversations need to come in. And it kind of goes back and reinforces some of the changes we saw on that. It was a practitioner piece that talked about the changes in 30 organizations moving away from the annual to more short-term goal, ongoing discussion. So, Peter, I don't know if we fully answered your question, but it's certainly constantly brewing in the background as we're looking at this stuff.
Well, I mean, I think
thank you. It was good. I appreciate it.
I mean, your question gets to the nub of this whole issue about what do we actually want from performance management, And, that's where we have to go in terms of academics. And that's, I mean, the interesting thing that Travor's talking about there, the lack of a wider international focus. There may well be some very good performance management systems going on elsewhere which we don't know about, and that's maybe it's a kind of a call to arms for those people who are studying those nations and looking at more innovative ways of managing performance. I think is what we really need.
Thank you. I had a question about from a research standpoint, and you mentioned just at the very end there, Martin, about how people may be doing performance management in different cultures in different ways that we aren't aware of because they're not studied or published in the same way that we have access to, or they don't write good abstracts, like you said, Travor. I'm curious about your thoughts from a research perspective. How do you, as a very global team, how do you perceive that your global identities assisted you in this literature review or this scoping review? Because it seems like these reviews are getting more and more popular, and some of them are done very, very well, and some of them less so. And what do you think, what's your big takeaway about doing these processes that would help, especially we have a few like doctoral students I've noticed on the call. Well, what advice would you give them, and what advantage do you think you have as a global team?
Boy, that's a lot in one breath, Oliver. I'll jump in, and then maybe Martin or Paula, if you want to jump in at any period of time. When I presented this to our PhD students here, I said, two things. One is I think doing a really systematic review is great to help make sure you've got a comprehensive lit review in your thesis. And I still go back to it now when I'm looking on, because I've got the data set, I'm looking for a paper on a certain topic. Downside, to be frank, is it's tough to get lit reviews published though. So that, when I'm advising newer doctoral students, that's the only thing I say is that your avenues for publishing a lit review are smaller than other types of more empirical, whether that be quant or qual. One of the things I think that hit me in a very simplistic way, if I had taken to start this from a purely North American perspective, I would have just started with the FT45 and left it at that. The advantage of having Paula and Martin, who knew the UK system and others very well, is we branched out to at least include the ABS list. So I think that was just one quick way for me for the advantage of having a more international perspective. And it's also the advantage, I'd say, about a systematic lit review. When I presented this as sort of a brown bag here, I was challenged around, well, years ago we used to just come to the top 5 journals. The problem of the top 5 journals is they're often very North American focused, and there's a richness in our data, particularly around context as an example, I don't think we would have gotten without broadening and doing a more systematic reviews. That'd be my quick answers, but I'll throw it over to Paula and Martin for anything from their perspective.
Certainly, I think what you said completely right, but I guess maybe, there would still be a tradition here in terms of more journals that are read by both academics and practitioners. And I think that really helped with this particular piece of work, in that we weren't precious about the journals. We were very wide and open. And maybe that was because of the traditions that we have in the various different nations. And this is what really helped this studies with. It helped you to be much more, much wider and more welcoming of other pieces. Ozzy, some of the things you said there again were very interesting about the kind of mechanics of writing an abstract, and I also edit journals as well, and certainly sometimes we get work from different nations, and perhaps it's my own bias that I was thinking, is this generalizable? And there are certainly issues there which we need to think about as well. And we're not listening to other parts of the world, and I think we need to become much more kind of much more wide open to this as well. Paula, you want to say something?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I think the key thing about having people with different, particularly around performance management, I think is actually viewed quite differently in different parts of the world, is that even Travor and I, whenever we're going through doing the second round of analysis on the abstracts, the ability to debate, we went through every abstract together. We spent hours and hours and hours on Skype or FaceTime, or I don't think we used Zoom at that time. No. And it was at times painful. At times, we could have done 2-hour stints, and having a discussion about every single abstract together was really important because we had quite different views about how we might have coded them at times. So having that, both as having 2 people do it, and obviously Travor had done another round as well prior to that, and also having people from different backgrounds do it, who perhaps I probably teach performance management quite differently to how Travor teaches it, because I teach it more within a New Zealand context. We're influenced by New Zealand law, which also impacts how we do performance management here. So I think that global team, and even doing a scoping review where we're not doing primary data collection, was really beneficial to really get down and understand those abstracts and what was going on behind the scenes in the abstracts. We also have a list here called the ABDC, which is what we use in Australia and in New Zealand. And now we didn't go to it. It was all getting a bit much, having done the FT45 and the ABS lists. And probably we should have been looking at the ABDC list, which again is similar, but it pulls out more Australia and New Zealand journals, which often don't make it into the ABS listings, or certainly not into the FT 45 either.
Great. Yeah.
The only thing I'd add from a somewhat joking perspective is there's a pro and con to having a research team that are literally 16 hours apart at some points. So sometimes scheduling us together can be quite challenging. So when Paula talks about those things, I was probably up around 5 or 6 in the morning, my time doing it. It was in the evening.
Wow.
On the upside, it's great for deadlines because we can have a paper that's moving 24 hours a day, because as one person is done and logging on with it, it's morning for someone else. So it's a bit of a catch-22 in terms of having us at literally 16-hour time zone changes at times.
I mean, I think go back to Martin's point around the sort of journals that we use, and I guess we find practitioners tend to use the journals that academics don't necessarily consider as rigorous, or are not at the top of the FT 45 or the A stars, or what do we call them in the UK now, 4 and 4 stars. Yes. And actually, I think that's where a lot of those conversations and the really good conversations are going on. So again, that gets into that whole debate about journal rankings and lists, and we all know that that's right there. And whether we agree with it or not, personally, I'll play the game, but I don't necessarily agree with the game.
Well, unfortunately, but I mean, we're all in that boat, aren't we?
Thank you. I'm going to have to end it there as we are out of time, but I cannot thank all of our wonderful presenters so much, especially Travor. Thank you so much. It was extremely enlightening and really a great model for research and integrating so many different pieces, trying to hold it all together. And it's a good thing that you had 4 people do on this project, because I can imagine it would be almost impossible to do by yourself. So I have to end it now, but I will let the recording will be posted. I will email everyone who participated. Thank you very, very much to our presenters. I wish we could all give you an uproarious applause, but unfortunately everyone's mics are muted, but you have mine and you have everyone's virtual applause as well. Thank you very much. And with that, I'd also like to special thank Dr. Bill Brantley for hosting and also coordinating with the authors as well. So thank you very much to all. We look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye.